Thank you for the invitation to INTI, to Linda, and to Michelle, and thanks everyone for being here. I have to say that I'm very glad that I'm the third one to go in this panel, because in some ways Wei-Wen has paved a kind of, I would say, a top-down, he may not agree with me, a top-down overview of the planning history of Shenzhen, and Stephen gave a very contextualized it within theoretical terms, especially within the current issues of globalization, and what does that happen, what does that mean for locality. So when Linda asked me to join this panel she called it top-down meets bottom-up, I thought that it would be interesting to try to bring to you a bottom-up way of explaining Shenzhen's development through one specific village, the one specific urban village has been talked about so much, and perhaps through talking about one specific site with all of its history, culture, physical aspects, we can gain a little bit of understanding, bit more of understanding of not only how the village has developed, but how Shenzhen has developed, and in some ways is a reflection of modern China. Because the previous speakers has covered this so much, I won't go over too much. You know, the history of Shenzhen typically starts being told, not necessarily the history of Shenzhen as per its real, but as per its told starts in 1979 or 1980. And there's a very good reason for that. This is a satellite image of Shenzhen in 1980, and the white spots you see are the built-up areas, whereas the green obviously are unbuilt. And we'll talk a bit about what is in those green areas, because it's normally assumed it's nothing, but in fact, it is one of the most agriculturally productive land in southern China. And that is important to the longer history that I would like to give. 1986, you can see the white built-up areas have drastically increased. 1990. 94, 98, 2002, 2004. So this is 10 years ago, and today is even more than that. So the basic figure that almost all presentations on Shenzhen is probably these two, that in 1980 the population is 300,000. Some people say it's 30,000, and I saw Wei-Wen's notes actually have the 30,000. 30,000 refers to the Luohu area, the one most adjacent to Shenzhen. It doesn't include the entire Shenzhen municipality. And I think it's important to say it's 300,000, because the population figure one compares with today is actually the entire municipality of Shenzhen and not just the Luohu area. So just want to be apples to apples. So 300,000 to 12 million. GDP, 1.9 million RMB to a GDP of essentially 10 billion euros in 30 years. To put that in a little bit of context, since we're in Almere, Almere started, I understand there's also a longer history of Almere. I saw that there was a population of 50 in the in the mid-1970s, but I figure I give it a little bit more weight and say when Almere municipality started established in 1984, there were 60,000, and today there are 200,000. And I want to remind you that figure I have showed you previously, Shenzhen in 1980 had a population of 300,000. It is not insignificant at all. And I think that this is one of the kind of underlying myths that's been created about this notion of the instant city in Asia, and I think about the instant city all across the world, that one assumes that it's a tabula rasa condition from scratch. Therefore, one assumes that any type of economic growth, social growth, cultural identities, has to have come from the top-down planning, the policy preferences, the foreign direct investment, et cetera, et cetera. And I think this is a very false model. If Shenzhen is a model, and indeed there are 6,000 special economic zones in in China, after the successful development of Shenzhen Economic Zone, there are more than 10,000 special economic zones in the world, and I would say most of them actually cite Shenzhen as an aspiration. And for me, it's very dangerous to be exporting a either intentionally misreading or unintentional misreading of how the city actually developed. Here you will see it's a diagram I created of tracing kind of the same urbanization pattern. In this case, the white areas are the built-up areas, as the satellite images I showed you earlier. But what I want to show you is something that is the topic today, which is this dilemma or this unique circumstances in China of rural land and urban land. One cannot understand why the urban villages exist in China without understanding this very fundamental difference. In 1998, the entire Shenzhen area is considered rural land. I'm going to skip through a few phases. This has come from a large, bigger timeline series. By 1990, you can see that the Shenzhen Special Economic Zone was set up quite fully blown already. And what you notice is that if in 1979, this is still designated as rural land, in 1990, the entire Shenzhen Special Economic Zone, it's urban land, but there are pockets of spaces within the city that is still designated as rural land. And those pockets of spaces designated as rural land are in fact the remnants of the agricultural villages that was essentially on Shenzhen's land prior to the Shenzhen Special Economic Zone being designated. In 1992, it wasn't until 1992 that these pockets of land in the city center of Shenzhen also became urbanized, meaning those land formerly was designated as urban land. So essentially by 1992, there were no more village land or village status within the special economic zone. And that same thing was repeated in 2010 when you see these yellow areas outside of the city center. These are the two larger peripheral districts. In 2010, these rural land, which again are the locations of the previous agricultural villages, also became urbanized. So by 2010, the slogan that people use is that by 2010, Shenzhen became the first city in China without villages. I'm going to jump to scale quite a bit because I did say that I want to talk more about the specifics of a site. So this has been mentioned in several of the slides in the previous panel speakers already. This is the CBD of Shenzhen. This is the city hall, essentially, of Shenzhen. It is, I think, to the planners and architects in the room, very familiar in that it's a centrally planned site. It has a kind of a large green space. It has a giant governmental symbol. It has two kind of flanking rows and columns, two flanking columns of high-rise commercial office buildings. And also it ends its access from a very large convention center. This central axis is very important because it actually governs every single building that's built on the central axis. This is standing right on axis under the giant roof of the government center, looking straight down towards Hong Kong. No less. So that photo is taken under this giant roof, looking straight down. you can see that this sort of central configuration suddenly ends here when it gets this pocket of the land. And what's happening is that if you look at the Snowlink map, is that it's hitting a pocket of very densely developed areas. In Wei Wen's earlier slide, he has shown that basically there are different enclaves even within CBD. This is the most expensive real estate land in Shenzhen. So these yellow areas essentially are the yellow spots. Some of the yellow spots I showed you in the larger developmental plan of Shenzhen, right? So from a much closer scale, what you see is that those yellow areas translate into these. These are very different neighborhoods in the city that has a very different spatial quality, social and cultural quality, and therefore, what people have called these is people call them urban villages. I will use that term today because that's the term most people have used. I prefer not to call them urban villages because it has a different connotation. The urban village has this other connotation of being these sort of quaint British towns and such. So, but today I will follow the protocols that's already set up. So these buildings you see in the foreground, I think no Western audience will ever think it looks like a village, right? But if you compare this with these buildings in the background, it is smaller, it is more compact, it is obviously of a different nature, a development. This is what it looks like from inside the village, looking out towards the city formal. I agree with Stephen that the informal and the formal designations are problematic. So I would try to also avoid those terms because I agree that informality deserves a much bigger discussion than perhaps what we have time for today. So essentially from the bottom up, from the ground, this is what you see. And this is all taken in Huanggang. On the street, it's extremely vibrant. It's very low key. It is absolutely pedestrian oriented. It's full of life. And again, these are very typical urban village buildings in Shenzhen. And for the case of Huanggang, and I will talk that a little bit perhaps why that is. Huanggang is probably the most well-organized, spatially well-planned, hygienic, with the best public space infrastructure of all of the urban villages in Shenzhen and probably in China. And this is what makes it a very interesting case to look at. So not only are there the vibrant street life you might have expected, the urban villages in this particular one in Huanggang has also very well-planned public spaces, including a southern China-styled garden with fish ponds, with kiosks, with walkways all around. So you can see that this is in the middle of the urban village buildings. It also has an ancestral hall. This ancestral hall actually was rebuilt in the 1990s. The original ancestral hall is not in this particular location. This was part of the village's own village redevelopment plan. They hired a professional planning company, and they basically proposed a 10-year master plan for the redevelopment of their own village. About the same time that central CBD urban planning was taking place. This is simultaneous. Happening in Shenzhen in the 1990s. So how does a village like this have the foresight or even have the organizational power or even the funding to be able to do this? So we have to go back a little bit into history. So this is based on a survey mapping by the United States War Office done in the 1950s. So these white spots you see are all of the built-up areas, which means they are already very highly urbanized village sites in the Shenzhen areas. Indeed, there were over 2,000 natural villages in Shenzhen prior to the special economic zone designation. And if we jump into scale again, in looking at the specific case of Huanggang Village, so in 1952, it already had a very kind of robust, I would say, building infrastructure in the middle of all of the farmlands, and they also had lychee groves for agricultural production. So it's not kind of this myth that other than the white built-up areas, the rest of the land was nothing. It was actually extremely utilized land. And if we echo back to the first panelist, you were talking about how the food production being kind of understanding food production being an important part of looking to the future. In fact, Shenzhen and in the urban villages was already like that. So if the previous one was 1954, by 1984, this is, I want to remind you, this is just 3 years after Shenzhen Special Economic Zone was designated. You can see that the village has already grown rapidly. These buildings, these elongated buildings, are industrial zones that the village have already set up, and they set these up with essentially the funding that was compensated to them when the government took over the land around them. So when the government took over the land, they gave them an amount of money for compensation of the land. It's very cheap if we talk about in terms of figures, but it was still a healthy amount. So what Huanggang Village did is that they took that money and they invested it. They invested in industrial investments and industrial zones. By the, say I have the figure. So by the 1984, they had, from the 24 production teams that was already in the village, they had set up into 52 subsidiary companies already. And these made garments, made chemicals, it made toys, mainly for exportation to Hong Kong. So by 1991, the village form that we see it today has already pretty much been set. So but at this time, the revenue profit of the industrial enterprises within the village is already at 40 million RMB per year. So it's not a small figure. So if one wants to kind of ask this question, how did Shenzhen grow so quickly in its economic value? I think that in addition to the usually discussed terms of top-down policy, foreign direct investment, if you imagine in a zone, there was already 2,000 very self-motivated, very well organized, because they had hundreds of years to organize. They elect their own village leaders. If you think about this, they already were mobilized and eager to start up. This is a vastly different situation from the myth that is of the instant city or the tabula rasa or the special economic zone. Since the 90s, as Shenzhen as a city moved from industry generation to, say, real estate or service investment, so did the village organization themselves. So they started to redevelop. I mentioned in the 90s, they started to have their 10-year development plan. They started to develop kind of new villages where they demolished their own older parts of the land and they built up towers. So all of these taller towers are already their own investments, meaning the image that you see of these tall buildings is not formal. It's not the formal city per se, actually. It is funding and development from the village themselves. By 2004, so this is all on village land. These are all either entirely self-developed or with a partner from from a development, a conventional developer. And by 2010, they have joined the largest developer in Hong Kong called the Excellence Group, 卓越, and they co-developed this 64-story high developments, one of the tallest in the CBD, and one of the most talked about, being the symbol of CBD development. So since time is up, I'm not going to talk to you about the second half of the lecture. I had actually planned for 20 minutes because that's what Linda was telling me. But I'm just going to show you very quickly what the government had wanted the village to become. So this is the urban village today from the figure. This was the master plan for this particular site. So if we want to recall back to the image that Michelle showed, all of the new towns in the world and in Asia, it's this image. In fact, the villagers themselves want this image as well. So that's kind of part of the dilemma, is that how do we go from this to this in a very sustainable and responsible way, learning from the way in which the villages themselves have already developed this land over the past hundreds of years. So I will show you very quickly this is a competition entry that because I'm also a practicing architect, I submitted to the Huanggang Village development competition, and it was organized by the Shenzhen municipal government to try to say, is there a different way of looking at the development? And that is not fixated on the form or the image of the new town or the new city, but really learning from how the village had developed themselves. So learning from the history of how the village developed, I developed 6 main concepts. That is continuity, porosity, flexibility, temporality, topology, and intensity. And that have led to a very intense analysis of how does each building not be pre-designated to be zoned for either commercial or residential, but how can it allow to have an independent function into the foreseen future and still follow the building code. What was really also very important is that learning from the village's own development, it was divided into 5 phases. And each phase was a calculated demolition and construction process, meaning the funding they would get from the demolition costs would invest into the next phase. So what essentially this means is that each of the 5 phases is completely independent, meaning rather than demolishing the entire village site and building that image you see, which is usually what happens and still happening, we only work with the villages to develop as needed. So each parcel, each of these stages in their own are already self-sustaining and complete urban planning and urban development. So this is in the hope that the process of development is much more organic, and it works with the existing green spaces the village would already have, the existing public spaces, and the existing road network, and much more importantly, the existing social network and social capital that the village company themselves already have. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Wendy, and thank you very much for making these incredibly clear maps and drawings, because I think one of the problems we have in talking about these subjects is that we don't actually know what we're talking about, and your succession of images for the the satellite images going to the maps to this makes actually very clear what we are talking about. What happened to your proposal? Is it going to be accepted, developed?
Well, my proposal actually won the competition, and we worked with the Planning Bureau and the Mayor's Office for 3 years on it. And then the mayor was no longer the mayor. So for now, you know, it's on hold. Huanggang obviously still want to develop on their own accord. The city still want it to develop in a certain way. So the negotiation is continuing. As an architect, this is a very different process what I normally used to, right? A building has a 2-year construction plan, but cities have, as I can show you,
different timeline.
hundreds year of a plan. Yeah.
Thank you, Jen. Do you want to take a seat over there? And